A soldier's discipline teaches him to move on, but a man's heart whispers when to turn back. For retired Coast Guard rescuer Ethan Marlowe, that whisper came from his loyal German shepherd, Atlas. One fog-heavy morning along the rugged shores of Maine's Penobscot Bay, Atlas led him to an abandoned lifeboat station buried in salt and silence. Inside, Ethan found a woman fading with fever and a little girl too afraid to speak. He had come to the edge of the sea to escape the ghosts of his past, but that morning, he became the only hope for their future. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story stirs your heart, please subscribe for more tales of faith, courage, and second chances. The morning mist over Penobscot Bay, Maine came not as weather, but as a living thing. Slow, deliberate, curling over the black pines and swallowing the coastline whole. The air carried the sharp scent of salt and iron, a constant reminder that here, the sea ruled over everything, men, wood, and memory alike. The waves rose and fell with the patience of ancient gods, thundering against the jagged granite cliffs before retreating into gray silence. It was a place where solitude did not merely exist. It lingered, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around the hearts of those who sought it. In a small wooden shack crouched above the rocks, Ethan Marlowe stirred a mug of instant coffee that had long gone cold. He was a man of 47, his body still cut from the mold of discipline, though softened by years of quiet exile. His dark blonde hair, threaded with gray, was cropped short, a habit that had outlived his uniform. His jaw was square but shadowed with stubble, his face weathered by wind and regret. Ethan had been a rescue diver for the U.S. Coast Guard, the kind who had spent years in the freezing Atlantic, pulling bodies from capsized trawlers, hearing the screams of storms that never stopped. One night, a night that returned to him in dreams, like a tide that refused to recede, he had failed to bring back a 12-year-old boy. The sea had taken the child right from his grasp, and with him, the last piece of Ethan's faith. Since then, he had withdrawn from the world and retreated to this edge of Maine, where the land itself felt forgotten by God. His only companion was Atlas, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of black and russet fur that gleamed when caught by stray shafts of light. Atlas had the sturdy build of a working dog, broad chest, powerful haunches, and a scar across his left ear from some long-ago encounter with barbed wire. His amber eyes were intelligent, alert, and almost painfully human. Ethan often joked that Atlas had seen more of the world's cruelty than most men. The dog had been a search and rescue K9, retired early after losing his handler in a flood operation. When Ethan found him in a shelter 3 years ago, the two broken souls had recognized each other instantly. They had since built a rhythm: silent mornings, long hikes, and evenings listening to the ocean hum like a tired machine. That morning was meant to be like all the others. Ethan had just stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing faintly, when the fog thickened and the gulls went quiet. Atlas was pacing near the bluff, nose twitching, ears pricked toward the east. The dog's muscles tensed like a drawn bow. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, setting down his coffee. Atlas gave a low growl, deep, rolling, not of fear but of certainty, and took off toward the shoreline path. "Hey!" Ethan called, grabbing his jacket. The wind bit through the seams as he followed. The path wound down towards the remains of the old lifeboat station, abandoned since the 1950s, when the last of the coast crews had left. It had once been a proud outpost of rescue and vigilance, but now only the tower's rusted skeleton and the broken launch rails remained, half swallowed by moss and seaweed. The locals said the place was haunted by the lost mariners it failed to save. Ethan, of course, didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in what he could see, touch, and bury. Atlas reached the base of the cliff first, sniffing frantically near the collapsed door of the main hall. The fog pooled thicker here, curling through broken window frames like smoke. The air smelled wrong: wet wool, mold, and something faintly metallic. Ethan felt a familiar ripple of dread crawl up his spine. He stepped through the doorway, boots crunching on shattered glass. "Atlas?" His voice came out lower than he intended. The dog barked once, sharp and urgent, drawing him toward the far corner. That's when Ethan saw her. A woman lay motionless on the cold floor, wrapped in a torn blanket that looked more like a discarded coat. She was maybe in her early 30s, tall and slender, with a long face softened by exhaustion. Her hair, chestnut brown and tangled, clung to her clammy forehead. The flickering beam from Ethan's flashlight revealed delicate features under the grime: freckles across her nose, lips cracked from dehydration, and skin pale as driftwood. Her breathing was shallow, labored. She wasn't dead, not yet. Ethan knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, his hand steady but his mind racing. Whoever she was, she hadn't been here long, or she'd already be part of the station's ruin. Her wrists bore faint bruises, restraints of some kind. That detail chilled him more than the cold. Then came a soft sound, so small he thought it was the wind at first. A shuffle, a whimper. Ethan turned. In the shadowed corner of the room, behind a pile of old ropes, a little girl watched him. She couldn't have been more than 5, her frame slight, her face half hidden by a curtain of dark hair. She wore an oversized gray sweater, probably the woman's, its sleeves dragging along the floor. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, her bare feet blackened with dirt. Her eyes, large, dark, and solemn, met Ethan's with an unnerving steadiness. Not the wide-eyed fear of a lost child, but the hollow caution of someone who had already learned the world could hurt. Atlas lowered himself onto his haunches beside Ethan, tail wagging once, gently. The little girl's eyes flickered toward the dog, and something thawed in her expression. She whispered, barely audible, "Atlas." Ethan blinked. "You know his name?" She didn't answer. Instead, she crawled forward slowly, each movement deliberate, until her small hand touched the dog's fur. Atlas stayed perfectly still, his warm breath steaming the cold air between them. The woman stirred faintly then, a weak moan escaping her lips. "Lena?" she rasped, her voice raw and cracking. "Stay with me!" The name hit Ethan like a signal flare. The child's name. Lena. He looked around the ruin of the station again. No food, no sleeping bags, no supplies. Just 2 souls who had washed ashore from some unseen disaster. Ethan's instincts took over. He slid an arm under the woman's shoulders, feeling the tremor of fever radiating from her skin. "You're safe," he said, unsure if she could hear. "I'll get you help." He glanced at Lena, whose expression didn't change, though her lip trembled. "She's burning up," he murmured. "We need to move her, boy." Atlas barked once, as if in agreement. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living wall. The tide was coming in fast, and the path back to his shack would be slippery, dangerous. But Ethan had carried heavier burdens before. He wrapped the woman in his jacket, lifted her with care, and gestured for Lena to hold on to Atlas's harness. The little girl obeyed without a word. Together, they stepped back into the mist. The ocean roared somewhere below, a dark beast gnawing at the rocks. Ethan tightened his grip on the unconscious woman, her head resting against his shoulder, and felt something stir within him. Something he thought the sea had drowned long ago. It was purpose. He didn't know who they were or what they were running from. But one truth was clear. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Behind him, the lifeboat station disappeared into the fog, as though it had never existed at all. The storm rolled in from the Atlantic with no warning, sweeping across Penobscot Bay like a vengeful memory. The wind howled through the pine ridges, bending the treetops and throwing sharp salt mist against the cliffside. Ethan Marlowe fought the rain as he climbed the steep trail back to his shack, the unconscious woman cradled in his arms. She burned with fever even as the cold wind lashed her face, her body shivering violently beneath his soaked jacket. Behind him, the little girl trudged silently through the mud, one small hand gripping the harness of the German shepherd who led the way. Atlas's fur was slick with rain, his ears flat against his skull, but his stride was steady, calm, protective, certain. They reached the shack just as lightning split the gray sky and thunder cracked like cannon fire. Ethan shouldered the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was cold and stale. A single lantern glowed faintly on the table beside a wood stove that hadn't been lit in days. He laid the woman on his cot and moved with mechanical precision. His hands, once trained to stabilize drowning victims, now moved on instinct, unrolling bandages, checking pupils, timing breaths. The years of training had never left him. They had only gone quiet, buried under the rubble of guilt. He filled a dented kettle with rainwater and placed it on the stove, coaxing a flame from damp matches. As the room warmed, he finally took a closer look at her. The woman was perhaps 32, maybe 33. Even under exhaustion and fever, she carried a kind of grace that didn't belong in such a place. Long limbs, fine bone structure, and skin that had once been fair, but was now blotched with sweat and grime. Her hair, chestnut and tangled, fell across her cheek in uneven curls. Beneath her lashes, faint freckles dotted her nose, giving her the look of someone who had once laughed often and hadn't done so in a long time. Ethan found himself wondering who she had been before the wilderness turned her into this ghost of survival. He reached for his old medic bag, faded olive canvas, the same one he'd carried during his last mission. Inside were the essentials: saline, antibiotics, gauze, a cracked thermometer. The tools of his former life, untouched for years. He cleaned a tin mug, poured water over a rag, and wiped the sweat from her forehead. The moment the cloth touched her skin, she jerked and gasped, whispering a single name through dry lips. Lena. The sound was soft but desperate. The little girl who had been crouched near the wall watching silently flinched at the word. Ethan turned. The child had removed her soaked sweater and sat in one of his old wool blankets, clutching the edge tightly beneath her chin. She was even smaller than he'd realized. Delicate shoulders, pale skin made almost translucent by the firelight. Her hair was dark brown, matted at the ends, and her eyes were large and watchful, the deep gray of the sea before a storm. There was no childish curiosity in her face, only a quiet calculation, as though she was deciding whether this man, this stranger, was safe. Atlas lay beside her, head resting on his paws, his tail sweeping the floor slowly in reassurance. She reached out a hand, tiny fingers sinking into the thick fur behind his neck. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. Ethan crouched beside her. "That your mom?" he asked softly, nodding toward the woman. Lena gave a single nod, not looking away from Atlas. "She's burning up," he murmured. "I need to help her." The girl didn't respond. Her fingers clung to the dog's collar as though it were the only anchor she trusted. Ethan sighed, rose, and returned to the cot. He hung an IV bag from a nail driven into the ceiling beam and slid the needle into the woman's arm with steady hands. He murmured half to himself. Hydration first, then antibiotics. The rain battered the roof, each drop sounding like a knock from the outside world he'd spent years ignoring. Hours passed in a blur of movement, the hiss of boiling water, the crackle of the fire, the slow rhythm of shallow breathing. Between tending the woman and watching the girl, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the fatigue. Focus? Responsibility? Purpose? The same emotions that had once defined him before the world unraveled. He found an old army blanket and wrapped it around Lena's shoulders, setting a small bowl of broth near her. She didn't eat it first, just stared at him with those silent, solemn eyes. "She'll be okay," he said, not sure if he believed it. The storm grew louder. At one point, a tree branch slammed against the window, making the child flinch. Ethan crossed to the wall and reinforced the shutters with an iron latch. When he returned, he noticed something odd on the shelf above the stove. A small child's backpack, bright blue, far too new for this old place. He pulled it down, unzipped it, and frowned. Inside were a few mismatched items: a folded jacket, a bottle of children's vitamins, a small stuffed bear with one missing eye, and buried beneath them, a sleek black satellite phone, its screen dark. Alongside it lay a metal flash drive, heavy, with an engraved locking mechanism like something from a corporate lab. Ethan turned it over in his hand, the metal cold and unfamiliar. "Who are you?" he whispered, glancing toward the unconscious woman. She stirred again, muttering something incoherent, her body arching slightly as a fevered tremor rippled through her. He caught words between her delirium. "He'll find us. Can't go back." The tone in her voice was raw terror, not confusion. Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't just sheltering survivors from the storm. He was harboring fugitives. Atlas lifted his head, sensing his master's unease. His ears pricked forward, eyes sharp. Ethan knelt beside him, scratching gently, behind his neck. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" The dog gave a low rumble, neither a growl nor a whine, something between warning and agreement. Ethan exhaled heavily, rubbed his temple, and looked at the sleeping child now curled beside Atlas, her breath shallow, but even. For the first time in years, the shack didn't feel empty, but the weight it carried was different, a fragile burden he hadn't chosen but couldn't abandon. Outside, the wind began to die, leaving only the soft hiss of rain on the roof. The woman's breathing steadied as the IV bag emptied. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the flickering fire. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this peace wouldn't last. Whatever these two were running from, it was coming closer with every wave that broke against the shore. And yet, as he looked at them, mother, child, and the dog asleep between them, he knew one truth as solid as the sea. He would not let them be taken. When dawn finally broke, it came not as light, but as a pale ghost moving through the mist. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world rinsed clean and cold. Ethan Marlowe stood outside his shack with a tin mug of coffee in one hand, the other resting on the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea met the bruised sky. The air still smelled of salt and smoke from the stove. Inside, the fire crackled softly, its glow spilling across the floorboards. Behind him, Atlas stirred, lifting his massive head and sniffing the wind before padding toward the cot. The sound of soft coughing came from within. Nadia Quinn was awake. Ethan turned, setting the mug aside. Her eyes were open now, glassy but aware, the fever's delirium replaced by exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but the effort sent a tremor through her slender frame. "Easy," Ethan said, stepping closer. "You've been through hell." She blinked at him, as if trying to place where she was. In the morning light, her features looked even more fragile, high cheekbones drawn sharp by hunger, a faint scar along her left temple, skin still too pale. "Lena," she rasped. "She's fine," Ethan said. "Sleeping. My dog hasn't let her out of his sight." Nadia's eyes softened for the first time, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "You saved us." Ethan shook his head. "I just did what needed doing." But there was no conviction in his tone. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the rhythmic tick of raindrops from the roof. Finally, she said, "You don't even know what you've stepped into?" Her voice cracked with fatigue, but beneath it was steel. Ethan crossed his arms. "Then maybe you should tell me." He had learned long ago that the truth, no matter how ugly, was always better than ignorance. Nadia looked toward the sleeping child curled beside Atlas near the hearth. The dog's tail thumped softly when she stirred, his eyes never leaving her. "Her name is Lena Hale," Nadia began. "She's 5. She's Victor Hale's granddaughter." Ethan frowned. "The biotech guy? The one who's always on the news?" "That's the one," she said bitterly. "He owns HaleGen, one of the largest biotech corporations in the country. They make gene therapy drugs, neurological stabilizers, memory inhibitors, or at least that's what the public thinks." Ethan sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. "And what do you think?" Nadia hesitated. Her hands were trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "I was his compliance officer," she said. "I audited internal ethics procedures, clinical data, trial transparency. That was my job. At least it was supposed to be." She gave a bitter laugh, soft and hollow. "But at HaleGen, transparency is a word they put in brochures, not practice." Her eyes flicked toward the sat phone and flash drive, now sitting on Ethan's table. "When I found what they were doing, I tried to go through the official channels. Within a week, my clearance was revoked, my apartment was searched, and my phone was wiped. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was an operation." Ethan leaned back, studying her. "What did you find?" For a moment, the only sound was the fire. Then Nadia spoke quietly. "They've been testing a compound called Neurovale, a drug meant to suppress emotional response, fear, empathy, even free will. They claim it's for trauma recovery, but they were running trials on children." Ethan's expression hardened. "You mean—" "Yes," she said. "Lena was one of them. Victor Hale signed off on it himself." Her voice broke on the words, but she forced herself to continue. "He told the world she was born with a neurological imbalance. He made it sound like treatment, but he was experimenting on his own granddaughter, turning her into something controllable, a legacy he could program." Ethan felt something cold twist in his chest. He looked toward the child again, asleep with one hand buried in the dog's fur. "Jesus," he muttered. "How long has she been like that?" "Since she was 3, Nadia said. "He dosed her regularly, under the guise of therapy. I didn't know until I reviewed the restricted files. I found proof. Lab results, transaction logs, internal memos, everything. That's what's on the drive." Her gaze drifted toward the flash drive gleaming faintly in the morning light. "Once I copied the data, I ran. I had to. He has people everywhere. Security contractors, ex-military, private investigators. He doesn't just protect his company. He erases threats to it." Ethan rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, absorbing every word. The details fit. The bruises, the silence, the fear. "And you think he'll come this far?" "He already has," Nadia said quietly. "Before we escaped Boston, I saw a black SUV parked outside my apartment 3 nights in a row. The same men followed us to Bangor. We switched buses twice, went off-road for 2 days, and still I felt eyes on us. Victor Hale doesn't lose things, Mr. Marlowe. He retrieves them. Ethan's mind flashed to the storm, the strange stillness before dawn, the way Atlas had bristled at the door last night. A hunter's silence. "Why here?" he asked. "Why Maine?" "Because it's the last place anyone would think to look," Nadia said, "and because my brother used to work on a lighthouse crew near Bar Harbor. I thought maybe—" She stopped, the words dissolving into the heavy air. "It doesn't matter now." For a long time, Ethan said nothing. He watched the firelight flicker across the woman's drawn face, the shadows under her eyes. Every instinct in him told him to walk away, to stay out of whatever storm she'd brought to his doorstep. But then his gaze fell again on the little girl. There was a quiet sadness to her sleep, a stillness that didn't belong to a child. He recognized it too well, the look of someone who had already lost too much. "All right," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You're not alone anymore, but if Hale's men come here, this place won't hold." Nadia looked up sharply. "You mean to fight them?" "I mean to keep you alive," Ethan replied. "That's all that matters right now." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust the words of a man she'd met less than a day ago. What she saw in his eyes wasn't bravado or pity, but quiet resolve, the kind forged only through failure. Slowly she nodded. "Then you should know what you're protecting." She reached toward her backpack, pulling out a small folder wrapped in plastic. Inside were printed pages, financial records, research data, photos. Ethan caught a glimpse of a corporate logo stamped at the top. Hale Gen Internal Memorandum, restricted access. The images showed a sterile lab, rows of hospital beds, and in one of them, unmistakably, the face of a little girl with dark hair and a blank expression. Lena. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You got her out." Nadia shook her head. "If he finds us, none of this will matter. He'll burn the world to keep his empire clean." She looked at him then, eyes fierce despite the tremor in her voice. "You don't understand, Ethan. If he finds us, no one survives." Outside, a gull screamed over the bay, the sound slicing through the morning calm. Atlas raised his head, ears twitching. The world seemed to hold its breath again, as if sensing the coming storm was no longer of nature, but of men. Ethan stared into the fog-choked horizon, his hand unconsciously brushing the scar on his wrist, a souvenir from another life, another battle. He thought he had left war behind, but now, he realized, war had come looking for him. The first hint of dawn crept like a thin silver blade across the horizon, slicing through the mist that blanketed Penobscot Bay. The shack sat quiet under the bruised sky, smoke curling from the stovepipe, the scent of damp pine heavy in the air. Inside, all was still. Nadia and Lena slept close together beneath Ethan's old wool blanket, their breaths soft and rhythmic. Atlas dozed near the doorway, his chest rising and falling, one ear twitching at every sound beyond the walls. Ethan sat by the window, awake, his instincts refusing to rest. Something in the silence felt wrong. The sea was too calm. The wind had died. The world was holding its breath. Then Atlas's head snapped up. A low growl rolled from his throat, deep and deliberate. Not the startled bark of a guard dog, but the restrained warning of a soldier. Ethan's pulse spiked. He reached for the binoculars hanging beside the door and crouched low by the window. Through the glass, the forest loomed dark and heavy, shadows shifting like oil between the trees. At first he saw nothing. Then, movement. 3 figures, low to the ground, moving with the precision of men who had done this before. They were dressed in matte black tactical gear, faces hidden under balaclavas, rifles fitted with suppressors. The faint green glow of night vision lenses cut through the fog like animal eyes. Ethan's gut turned to stone. These weren't police or searchers. They were professionals. His training recognized it instantly. The spacing of their formation, the silent hand signals, the methodical advance toward high ground. At their center was a taller figure, broader in the shoulders, moving with calm authority. That would be Kellen. Ethan had known men like him, career soldiers who couldn't live without a mission. Kellen was in his late 40s, hair cut military short, face lined and weathered, a thin scar running from temple to jaw, a souvenir from a war that had long since forgotten him. His eyes, when visible beneath the visor, were cold and calculating, the kind that measured risk the way others measured heartbeats. Ethan slipped the binoculars down and moved to the small weapons chest beside the stove. Inside lay an old Sig Sauer P226, a relic from his Coast Guard days, freshly oiled the night before. He loaded the magazine, checked the chamber, then turned to Atlas, who stood poised and alert, hackles bristling. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We do this smart." He crossed to Nadia, shaking her gently awake. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to fear the moment she saw his face. "They're here," he said quietly. "Get Lena behind the woodpile. Don't move until I say." Nadia didn't question him. She only nodded, scooping up her daughter, who stirred and whimpered, too sleepy to understand. Ethan watched as they slipped into the far corner, shielded by the stacked logs. He took position near the window, breathing slow, steady. The first two intruders reached, the edge of the clearing, crouching low. Kellen raised a hand, signaling halt. Through the mist, Ethan could almost hear their quiet radio clicks, the synchronization of a well-drilled team. He'd been on the other side of operations like this once, but now he was the target. A grim smile ghosted his lips. Not today. He raised the pistol and fired 3 quick shots, not at the men themselves, but into the trees behind them. The gunfire cracked like thunder in the still air, echoing off the cliffs. The effect was immediate. The attackers dove for cover, assuming a larger defensive perimeter. In the confusion, Ethan shouted, "Atlas, go!" The dog launched forward through the half-open door, a streak of black and tan fury disappearing into the fog. Ethan moved fast, firing again from a different angle, creating the illusion of multiple shooters. From outside came the muffled curse of one of the men, an accent faintly southern. The air filled with tension, the kind of silence that comes right before chaos. Then came the flash. A grenade rolled across the dirt floor, clinking against the wall before Ethan could react. "Down!" he yelled, diving behind the table. A blinding white explosion tore through the shack. The sound vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that swallowed everything. Light burned into his retinas. He felt the world tilt sideways. Through the haze, shapes moved, dark, fast, methodical. He tried to raise his weapon, but a boot caught his wrist, slamming it against the floor. The pistol skittered away. Atlas lunged back through the doorway, jaws locking around a man's leg. The mercenary screamed, stumbling, his rifle clattering from his grip. But another shadow stepped forward, a man nearly 6 feet, solid, with cold gray eyes visible beneath the visor. Kellen. Without hesitation, he kicked the dog hard in the ribs, sending Atlas sprawling with a yelp. The crack of impact made Ethan's stomach twist. He roared, lunging forward, but 2 men pinned him down, their knees grinding into his shoulders. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. "Hold him," Kellen ordered, voice calm, professional. He removed his mask, revealing a rugged face marked by years of violence. His expression was neither cruel nor kind, simply detached. "Marlowe," he said evenly, surprising Ethan with the use of his name. "You've made this harder than it had to be." Ethan spat at the floor. "Who sent you?" Kellen didn't answer. Instead, he motioned to one of his men, who moved towards the corner where Nadia crouched, shielding Lena with her body. "No!" Ethan shouted, thrashing against his captors. Nadia's eyes widened as the mercenary grabbed her arm. "Please, she's just a child," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The man ignored her, pulling her roughly to her feet. Lena screamed, trying to cling to her mother's coat. For the first time, Ethan saw raw terror in Nadia's face, a fear not for herself, but for the small life in her arms. Kellen's jaw tightened. "We're not here to hurt them," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Our employer wants them alive." "Your employer," Ethan hissed, "is a monster." Kellen regarded him for a moment, something flickering behind those cold eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or memory. Then it vanished. "Monsters pay better," he replied quietly. He turned toward the door. "Secure them. We move before full daylight." One of the mercenaries drew zip ties from his vest, binding Ethan's wrists behind his back. Another kicked away the pistol lying near the stove. Atlas lay motionless by the wall, his flank rising weakly. Ethan's heart clenched at the sight, a helpless fury building in his chest. He wanted to fight, to tear these men apart, but his body refused to obey. The storm outside had faded, replaced by the sound of waves breaking against the cliffs. Pale light seeped through the cracks in the wall, revealing the quiet devastation inside. The overturned table, shattered glass, the fear etched into Nadia's face. Kellen stood in the doorway, framed against the cold dawn. "You should have stayed invisible," he said softly. "Now it's too late." Ethan lifted his head, meeting Kellen's gaze with defiance. "You have no idea what you've started." Kellen gave the faintest shrug, the ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "I never do," he said, and stepped outside. The other men followed, dragging Ethan with them into the gray morning. The wind howled across the cliffs again, carrying with it the echo of the life Ethan had tried so hard to forget. War, loss, and the unrelenting choice between survival and sacrifice. The shack smelled of gunpowder, salt, and fear. Ethan knelt on the cold floor, wrists bound tight behind him, but his face was composed, unreadable. Across the room, Nadia sat with her arms around Lena, the little girl's eyes wide and glassy, clutching the torn strap of her backpack like it was life itself. Atlas lay by the door, breathing shallowly but alive. The mercenaries moved like restless wolves, pacing in the gray light of dawn that leaked through shattered planks. Kellen stood near the window, a statue of control, his scarred face still, his mind visibly calculating. "We move soon," he said, his tone professional, almost bored. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You won't get far," he said, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a blade. Kellen turned, one eyebrow raised. "Is that a threat?" "A fact," Ethan replied, his eyes locked on him. "I triggered a federal distress beacon when you hit the tree line. My vitals and GPS are broadcasting in real time to a joint ops unit in Virginia. If they lose my signal, they send a strike team. They won't negotiate. They'll erase everything." The air thickened instantly. Tanner, the bearded one, stopped pacing. Reese, the younger, nervously adjusted his grip on the rifle. Kellen's gray eyes didn't waver, but a flicker of doubt rippled behind them. "You expect me to believe that?" he said. "Believe what you want," Ethan said calmly. "But when that helicopter breaks the horizon, it won't matter." He spoke with the confidence of a man who had seen operations turn to slaughter in seconds, who knew the power of controlled fear. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through broken glass. Tanner spat. "He's bluffing." Ethan smiled faintly. "You sure you want to bet your life on that?" Kellen's jaw tightened. He'd been on missions where lies like this saved lives, or ended them. The possibility was enough to unsettle even a seasoned killer. Before he could respond, a soft, tired voice spoke from the shadows. "He's not bluffing." Nadia's words were quiet, hoarse, but carried a conviction that cut through the tension. She rose, helping Lena stand beside her, the child's hand still gripping the corner of her jacket. Her face, pale and drawn, was illuminated by the weak dawn. "And even if he were," she said, "you'd still be dead if you pull that trigger." Kellen frowned, curious despite himself. "And why's that?" Nadia pointed at the small, dirt-smeared backpack on the floor. "Because in there is a drive that contains every criminal act your boss, Victor Hale, has ever buried. Illegal trials, political bribes, everything. If I don't log in with my biometric ID every 24 hours, it automatically sends copies to the FBI, the SEC, and the New York Times." Tanner let out a bitter laugh. "She's lying." But his voice cracked. Reese's knuckles turned white around his rifle. Kellen didn't move. "You expect me to believe Halegen's former compliance officer just walked off with his secrets?" Nadia met his gaze, her green eyes unwavering. "Ask him about the Providence fire." The name landed like a detonation. Even Tanner blinked. "What fire?" 3 months ago," she said evenly. "A data center in Providence burned down. The official report blamed faulty wiring. But it wasn't wiring, was it? It was an order, from Victor Hale himself, to erase everything before the auditors came. He didn't count on me having backups." Her voice didn't rise, but the certainty in it was terrifying. Ethan watched Kellen's expression shift, the faint narrowing of his eyes, the tightening around his jaw. He was connecting the dots, and it scared him. "You can't prove that," he said at last. "Then kill us and find out," she replied. Tanner swore quietly. "Boss, this is bad. This whole job stinks. Let's just take the kid and go." Kellen turned a slow, warning look on him. "We don't leave witnesses." But even as he said it, his tone faltered. Ethan saw the hesitation and pressed. "You know what kind of man Hale is. You've seen it before. Guys like him don't pay. They purge. Deliver us, and you'll disappear next." Reese glanced at Tanner. "He's not wrong, boss. You heard what happened in Caracas. Hale's team vanished after that job." Kellen's silence was an admission. The chain of command, the cold professionalism, all of it was cracking under the weight of doubt. Nadia stepped closer, voice steady. "You think you're working for a man. You're not. You're working for a ghost who erases every trace of his mess. But there's one thing he can't erase. Truth. And that's what we carry." Kellen stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. The gesture wasn't surrender. It was something rarer. Reconsideration. "You two," he said finally, voice low, "are very good liars." Ethan's lips curled faintly. "We've had practice." The gray light poured stronger through the window, painting the room in pale gold. The storm outside had gone, but its echo still hummed in the walls. Kellen turned to Tanner and Reese. "Hold position. No one moves until I say." Tanner started to protest, but stopped at the look in his commander's eyes. The mercenaries exchanged wary glances. Kellen holstered his sidearm, his voice quieter now. "Maybe," he said. "You just bought yourselves a few more hours." Ethan exhaled slowly, tension releasing just enough for his muscles to stop burning. He looked at Nadia, who gave the smallest nod, a silent understanding that they had survived this round, not by bullets, but by words. The war had shifted. Outside, the first true light of morning broke over the cliffs, washing the bay in cold silver. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, listening to the wind and the faint breath of Atlas by the door. For now, they were alive. And that was enough. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy fog that still lingered over the cliffs of Penobscot Bay. The air smelled of burnt timber, salt, and tension. Ethan sat with his back against the cold wall, wrists raw from the zip ties Kellen had finally cut loose. Across the ruined shack, the mercenaries lingered in uneasy silence, their faces pale under the gray light. Tanner rubbed his temples, muttering curses under his breath. Reese cleaned his rifle mechanically, but his eyes darted often towards the woman and child sitting by the stove. Kellen stood near the door, staring into the mist as if searching for a version of himself that wasn't here. He looked older than before, his jaw set, the scar on his cheek like a mark of weariness rather than pride. The decision was eating at him. Ethan watched him carefully, studying the conflict behind that stoic face. He had seen this kind of man before, hardened by orders, haunted by memory, living too long in the gray space between duty and damnation. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "There's a way out for all of us," he said. Kellen didn't turn. "You've had plenty of words already, Marlowe. I'm listening only if it doesn't end in bullets." Ethan's tone was calm, methodical. "It doesn't. It ends in smoke." That got his attention. Tanner frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Ethan leaned forward. "It means we fake it. You report the mission as complete. 3 dead in a cabin fire. Croft, your boss, gets what he wants. You and your men get your full payment. No one comes looking." Kellen's gray eyes narrowed. "And the proof?" "You'll have it," Ethan said, glancing toward Nadia. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached into the child's backpack and retrieved a small encrypted flash drive. Sleek, metallic, marked with Hale Jen's emblem. "One verified file," she said quietly. "Financial records from a dummy shell corporation he used to funnel bribery payments. It's real. It's enough to convince him the data's been destroyed in the fire." Kellen stepped closer, his boots crunching on the scattered debris. He took the drive, rolling it between his fingers. "And what guarantees me you won't go running to the authorities the moment we walk out?" Nadia met his stare. Her green eyes, once dimmed by exhaustion, now gleamed with quiet defiance. "You're a soldier, Kellen. You know what leverage looks like. If we wanted revenge, we wouldn't be offering you a deal." Tanner scowled. "Boss, this is insane. He'll kill us if he finds out." "He won't," Ethan cut in. "You'll stage it clean. Accelerant, a controlled burn. Leave behind personal effects, some bone fragments from your supplies. He'll send a verification team, see what you want him to see. You get your money. You walk away ghosts." The plan hung in the air like a blade. Reese shifted uneasily. "What if he finds out?" Kellen looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then at Nadia and Lena. The woman standing tall despite the bruises, the child clutching the dog's fur as if it were the last piece of the world still kind. "He won't find out," Kellen said at last, "because he'll want to believe it." His tone was final. Tanner opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look in his commander's eyes. Kellen wasn't doing this out of mercy. He was doing it because survival demanded it. Without another word, he handed the drive to Tanner. "Prep the accelerant." The mercenary muttered under his breath but obeyed, moving outside with a canister of fuel. The others followed, gathering what they needed to make the illusion complete. Ethan rose, his muscles aching. He looked down at Atlas, who had limped closer to Lena. The dog's fur was matted with dirt and blood, but his eyes were clear, alert, steady, loyal. Ethan rested a hand on his head. "We're going home soon, boy," he murmured. Atlas gave a low rumble, as if he understood. Within minutes, the air outside filled with the sharp, chemical scent of gasoline. Tanner splashed the fuel across the walls and floor, cursing under his breath with every motion. Reese rigged a few personal items, a torn jacket, a dog tag, a broken wristwatch, to make it look convincing. Nadia stood beside Ethan, clutching Lena's hand tightly. Her face was calm, though her fingers trembled. The child whispered, "Will it hurt?" Nadia knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "No, sweetheart. We're leaving the hurt behind." Kellen watched them in silence. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Respect, maybe even regret. He tossed Ethan a small combat knife. "Cut the ropes on the supply dock," he said. "You'll need a boat to disappear." Ethan caught it without a word. The edges of the plan were coming together like fragments of a broken compass finding north again. When everything was ready, Kellen struck a match. The flame flared bright, trembling in the wind. For a brief second, he held it between his gloved fingers, staring at it as though it contained every sin he'd ever buried. Then he let it fall. The fire caught instantly, racing across the gasoline-soaked planks, roaring to life like a beast freed from its cage. The cabin crackled, the windows glowing orange, smoke curling into the gray dawn. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching the past burn itself clean. Ethan, Nadia, and Lena crouched near the tree line, Atlas pressed to their side. The dog's fur bristled, his eyes reflecting the blaze. The heat reached them even through the fog. Kellen approached one last time, his silhouette framed by the fire. "If you ever cross my path again," he said evenly, "I'll finish what I started." Ethan nodded. "Fair enough." There was no hatred between them now, only mutual acknowledgement. Two soldiers caught in different wars. Kellen turned, motioning, for his men. "Let's move." Within moments they vanished into the mist, swallowed by the same silence from which they had come. Ethan lifted Lena into his arms. The child buried her face against his shoulder, trembling as the flames consumed the shack. Atlas walked beside them, limping but resolute. Nadia followed, her eyes fixed on the fire that had once been their prison and now their salvation. The reflection of the blaze shimmered on the wet ground, painting the fog crimson like a dying sun. They crossed the marshland, their boots sinking into the salt-water mud, each step pulling them farther from death and closer to uncertainty. The gulls cried overhead, the sea murmured below, and the smoke curled upward like a prayer. By nightfall, the three of them reached the old wooden dock where weathered fishing boats rocked gently in the tide. Ethan found one small vessel half buried in kelp, its paint chipped, and its name, Isla Rose, barely legible. "She'll float," he said. Nadia nodded, exhausted but trusting. Together they pushed it into the dark water. Lena climbed aboard first, followed by Atlas, whose paws left wet prints on the worn deck. As Ethan started the small motor, the hum of the propeller broke the night's silence. Behind them, the coastline flickered with the dying light of the fire. "Don't look back," Ethan said softly. Nadia turned her face toward the open sea. "I wasn't planning to." The boat drifted into the fog, carrying them toward an uncertain dawn. 3 weeks had passed since the fire. Winter had arrived early in Bar Harbor, soft and quiet, brushing the coast of Maine with the first silver frost. The small cottage Ethan found stood beneath a canopy of ancient pines, their branches heavy with snow. Smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney, curling into the pale morning sky. Inside, The air was warm with the smell of pine resin and black coffee. The world outside seemed distant, muffled by snow and peace. Ethan sat by the window, his rugged face softened by the light. The lines of fatigue that once carved his brow were still there, but now they seemed gentler, wounds in the process of healing. His beard had grown in rough patches along his jaw, a silvering reminder of years spent at war with both men and memory. He wore a wool sweater and faded cargo pants, his boots drying near the stove. For the first time in years, he looked like someone learning to exist rather than merely survive. Nadia stood by the counter, her hair, now clean, trimmed, and the color of chestnut bark, falling freely over her shoulders. Her skin had regained its warmth, the fever's pallor replaced by a quiet glow. The woman who had once trembled in delirium now moved with grace and composure, each motion measured but unafraid. She wore a thick, knitted sweater, one Ethan had found in the attic, and the sleeves hung slightly past her wrists. Her eyes, green like moss in morning dew, followed Lena as the little girl played outside in the snow. "She's laughing again," Nadia said softly. Her voice was low and melodic, touched by disbelief. Ethan followed her gaze. Lena was rolling a ball of snow twice her size, her small hands red from the cold, but her laughter bright and clear. She was a slight child, 5 years old, with long brown hair tied in a messy braid and cheeks flushed pink by the wind. The weight that once shadowed her eyes had lifted. She was still quiet at times, but now she sang softly to herself while she played. Atlas was beside her, bounding through the drifts, his thick tan and black coat gleaming against the white. He was stronger again, his limp almost gone, though a faint scar ran across his side, a reminder of the fight he had survived. His amber eyes tracked Lena's every move with devotion. When she stumbled, he nudged her upright with his muzzle. When she laughed, his tail wagged like he was keeping rhythm. Nadia smiled. "He's more guardian than dog." "He's both," Ethan replied. "That's why he's still here." He looked at them for a long moment, the corners of his lips twitching into something that might have been called a smile, a rare, honest thing. "I think we all are." The radio on the table crackled softly, breaking the stillness. Ethan reached over and adjusted the frequency. The old transmitter, one he had rebuilt from the wreckage of his past, emitted faint static, and then the distant sound of waves. No distress calls, no coordinates, no military. Chatter. Just the low hum of the sea. "You fixed it," Nadia said. Ethan nodded. "Not to send anything, just to listen." He turned the knob until the rhythm of the waves filled the small cabin, mixing with the crackle of the fire. Sometimes the ocean doesn't want an answer. It just wants to be heard. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and delicate. Lena looked up, catching flakes on her tongue. Atlas barked once, leaping through the snow in delight. The sound made Nadia laugh, a sound Ethan hadn't realized he'd missed. She moved closer to the window, crossing her arms. "So," she said, her tone half teasing, half wistful. "What happens now? Where do we go?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the horizon through the glass. The sun was climbing, turning the mist above the bay into gold. "We already did," he said quietly. "We found where we belong." Nadia turned to him, her expression softening. "You mean here?" "Here," Ethan said. "And now. For the first time, that's enough." There was silence between them. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, like the pause after a long storm. Later that morning, they walked to the water's edge. The tide had frozen in thin patches, and the sunlight shimmered across it like glass. The small fishing town of Bar Harbor was just waking up in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the toll of a church bell echoing faintly across the hills. Ethan carried a small wooden crate filled with parts of his old life, a broken compass, a bullet casing, a folded photograph of men he once called brothers. He placed it gently on the rocks and watched as the tide began to carry it away. Nadia stood beside him, her hand brushing against his. "A burial?" she asked. "A promise," Ethan said, "to let the past rest." Behind them, Lena called out, waving a stick like a flag. Atlas bounded toward her, sending snow flying in glittering arcs. The sight drew a genuine smile from Ethan, a small, tired smile, but real. "She's tougher than we give her credit for," he said. "She's her mother's daughter," Nadia replied. Ethan looked at her, and for a moment neither spoke. The sea filled the space between them, endless and forgiving. When they returned to the cabin, the sky had cleared completely. The sunlight poured through the windows, touching everything with warmth. Ethan poured 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Nadia. "To new beginnings," she said. "To surviving them," he replied. They clinked the cups together gently, a small ceremony of gratitude. Outside, the church bell from town rang again, its sound faint but resolute, carrying over the frozen fields and into the bay. As the morning brightened, the 3 of them, man, woman, child, and the loyal dog, stood in the threshold of the small home beneath the pines. The fire behind them crackled, the waves whispered in the distance, and the light from the rising sun painted their faces in gold. It wasn't a triumphant ending, nor a perfect peace, just the quiet certainty that, after everything, they were still here. And sometimes survival was its own kind of grace. In the stillness of that dawn, as the church bell echoed across the bay and the light touched their faces, it became clear. What saved them was never just luck or strength. It was grace. The kind of grace that moves unseen, like the tide under moonlight. Maybe it was chance that led Ethan to that cabin, or maybe it was God's hand guiding him through the fog. For in every storm we survive, there's a moment, quiet, almost sacred, when we realize we were never walking alone. This story reminds us that miracles don't always arrive in thunder or fire. Sometimes they come as a loyal dog who refuses to give up, a stranger's kindness, or a sunrise that whispers, "You still have time to begin again." Ethan found his redemption not in escape, but in love. Love that heals, forgives, and endures. And in that love, we see the reflection of something divine. May we all learn to listen when God speaks through silence, to trust His timing, even when we can't see the shore. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe, and let your light be part of this journey of faith, mercy, and second chances. May God bless you and protect your home, your family, and every loyal companion who reminds you that no one is ever too lost to be found again.